on page 1 of our outline. Tonight we are going to finish the introduction. Page 2 will start into one of the sections of our study in looking at the Synoptic Gospels. So our topic for tonight would be letter B, current options for studying the material of the New Testament. Now you might have never thought of the various ways. The various ways are really a variety of orders in which we can study the New Testament, but there are several of these, and we need to look at them and select the best one for this class. Now we're talking about study the New Testament. We're not talking about just reading it. Reading has its place and study has its place. Some of the methods, some of the order of study you'll find to be better, more beneficial, with fewer problems than some of the others. These are all listed for you, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the outline. So I'm going to go according to the outline again and comment on that. First of all, we'll look at the literary nature approach. The literary nature approach. Now, I purposely have all of this in order because you notice that we just ended our last study concerning the literary nature of the books of the New Testament. That's under big letter A, number 6, small letter C, which was last Wednesday night. So purposely we have literary nature under that part of our study, which was along a different line, right together with literary nature here, just to make it easier to remember. So we want to come back to something in review. So what I mean by that is under this option, and it's an option that some New Testament survey or introduction books will follow, we would study in order of the literary nature of each book. In other words, we would have 4 divisions: the historical, the doctrinal, the personal, and then we'd look at the prophetic books of the New Testament. Books singular for the last group, but books plural for the other. Historical, doctrinal, personal, and then the prophetic books of the New Testament. That's called the literary nature approach. Now the plus under this type of study is that once you discuss what you mean by the historical books in general, the doctrinal in general, personal in general, and so forth, you don't have to go over that again. All of the New Testament books that are historical, that are doctrinal, that are personal, that are prophetic, you study under that heading. So once you've discussed what you mean by historical, it doesn't have to be repeated. If you divide up any of the doctrinal, such as maybe Paul had some doctrinal, and then James has some doctrinal, and then John has some doctrinal, well, then you keep coming back to doctrinal, but in between the doctrinal, you may find some personal things there. So one plus is it tends to keep some measure of continuity, at least as far as these literary approaches are concerned. Once the general genre of literature has been discussed, then it does not have to be repeated again. But there's a problem also with the literary nature approach in that it separates, therefore, some of the writings of Paul and John from earlier works, which would mean you'd need then 2 discussions of the Apostle Paul, at least anyway, and 2 discussions of the Apostle John. I mean, you have, let's take John for an example. You have John writing an historical book, the Gospel. You have John writing a doctrinal book, his first epistle. You have John writing a personal book, his third epistle, written to Gaius, his friend. You have John writing a prophetic book. John, the only one, by the way, who fits under all 4 literary approaches. Which, by the way, says a lot concerning the writing ability of the Apostle John. That smelly fisherman, we're often told in Sunday school, could write historically, doctrinally, personally, and apocalyptically or prophetically. Quite an author, I would say. Today, generally, if someone's a good writer, they're a good writer in a field, children's stories or science fiction or biographies or Civil War novels. But when you can go over the whole spectrum of literature and contribute something that's worthwhile, and John's literature has stood the test of time, 2,000 years. You won't find a lot in print today that'll be in print 2,000 years from now, if the world turned that long. Then you've gone a long way in saying a lot about, well, I know what you're thinking, maybe not so much the man John, but the Holy Spirit behind it all. But he works through the Apostle John. John had to have some type of tool for the Holy Spirit to use to his own advantage and benefit and for his own glory and purposes and ends. So John is contributing something historically, doctrinally, personally, and prophetically. So if we follow the literary nature approach, we're splitting John up into 4 different Johns then. We already have 3 of them with the epistles. We're splitting up into 4 now. And we have to keep coming back and saying, I know we discussed John's history of the life of Christ and his gospel, but now in 1 John we've got to tell you who the author is. Well, it's John. Well, what do we know about John? Well, then we go over the information we've already gone over from whenever we discussed the author's background to the Gospel of John. And then that's duplicated again with personal and again with prophetic. So the conclusion would be, I'm not going to follow the literary nature approach. It just has that problem, which is too large of a problem to me. And you don't find, by the way, a whole lot of NT intro or survey books that will follow the literary nature approach, although I trust you can see it's certainly a viable one. Secondly, we have the English arrangement approach. Now, this is generally the way the New Testament is read. But, again, I remind you of the fact we're talking about studying the New Testament, not just reading. The English arrangement approach, which means just what it sounds like it means. Here we would take the books in order, just as we find them in our English New Testament. Now, it has a plus on its side. All of these will have some things for and perhaps some things against them. We just have to weigh them and see which outweighs the other, which is the better of the approach than the others, or the best of the 4 different approaches. This plus is that it keeps most of the authors together. It keeps most of the authors together. It's a fairly good technique. It's generally the technique that's followed in low-level New Testament survey books. By the way, let me just say something about these different names I keep throwing out to you, New Testament survey and New Testament introduction. This isn't always true, but generally if a book or a class is called New Testament survey, then it's a lower level type class, a New Testament introduction. Introduction is supposed to be a higher term that deals with a few more of the formalities of New Testament studies. Most of the books that I brought here some weeks ago when we first began this class in NT Intro were named just that, an introduction to the New Testament introduction. A few of them would be exceptions, such as Tenney's, which is New Testament survey. We've named our class New Testament Introduction, but there'll be a lot of things that I purposely leave out, and I'll comment on that whenever I get down to chronology here in a moment. The problem with the English arrangement approach is similar to the literary nature approach. It separates some of John's writings. Particularly, it really separates his gospel from the last 4 of his writings. The only thing you have between the 4th and the 5th writing or book of John would be the little epistle of Jude. So basically you've got his 3 epistles in the book of Revelation together. In other words, you turn to the end of the New Testament and you find the writings of John, with the exception, however, of his gospel. Now, last week we looked at the historical books and then doctrinal, and we saw how all of Paul's were grouped together, all 13 or 14, however many you want to count of Paul's epistles are grouped together, and we looked at the suggested reasons why this was done and so forth. So the English arrangement approach, I would say, would be a fairly good technique. I think people are basically more familiar with the Gospel of Matthew than any of the other Gospels. That's not because Matthew is more important, it's because of the obvious. Matthew is first. And how many people ever read the end of a book once they start? How many books have you read all the way through? You'll read the first chapter or 2 and get bogged down, or for whatever reason, you put it on the shelf and won't ever finish. Now, you often hear in Bible studies and evangelism and counseling and classes like this and so forth, that if you're going to recommend anything, recommend John, the Gospel of John, because it really shows the humanity as well as the deity of Christ. Recommend that for new converts to read as their first gospel to read, not Luke. Luke is long, and it can be rather boring with some of Luke's historical details, and not Mark because it's so short and compact you might miss something, and not Matthew because it's too Jewish, but read John. But John is the deep one. I mean, of all, John is the theological gospel of the four gospels. I don't know that I'd recommend John. I just recommend read all of them. I don't know which one to start with. I guess Matthew would be a good one. Someone years ago thought Matthew was a good one, and then Mark was the second one, and Luke was the third one, and by then you're ready to handle John. You've already got all the background and the history, because John doesn't give us much of that. He goes right into the theology of this one saying, I am the bread of life, and the water of life, and the light of life, and the good shepherd, and well, you need to be prepared to get into John. So I don't know that that little Navigator's Campus Crusade for Christ precedent is the best one to follow. Jump into John. I'd say jump into Matthew. But statistics have proven, as just a fact of the matter, that Matthew is the more read, let's say, of the four Gospels, in spite of the fact a lot of these groups are recommending John. And there's nothing wrong with John. I'm just saying what I'm saying, that John is a heavyweight of the four. Start with Mark. That's the easiest one to get through. And then go to Matthew, and then go to Luke, and then whatever order you want, be fine. But I think English arrangement is fairly good because people are familiar with those first books, and you get them into that which they're already familiar with, and maybe you can set the hook in their mouth, as it were, to use a fishing metaphor, and take them through the rest of the New Testament. Then our third option is the chronological approach, and here we've got two different options underneath this third major option. The chronological approach. We either have the option of composition date or event date. This is all on your outline for you. You can just set the outline and your notes up right the way it's set up in your outline. Composition date or event date. Now let me say something about separating these two. It's not always consistent. It's not always a true separation. For instance, the composition date, the date it was composed of the Epistle of Romans, is the same date as the event that it was written about or concerning. It's all the same. You primarily have a difference when you come to your historical books. The events of Matthew took place at an entirely different time than the date when the gospel was composed. Now that's something that people often forget. I know it's just so elementary, none of you would have ever forgotten that, but it's often forgotten by people, that the date of composition comes quite a bit after the date of the events. The same is true with Mark, Luke, John. The same is true with the book of Acts. Now that doesn't hold true with the epistles, but it holds true with the historical books, that there's a difference, a separation of, perhaps several decades or a few score years, when you go to the very beginning of the Gospels, between the date of composition and the date of the events which the book records. Let's go back up to composition date as the first chronological approach option and see what we have here. This would then obviously take the date in which the book was written as a point of departure of study. You wouldn't go back to 4 BC and try to start studying Luke or Matthew just because they record the birth of Christ that took place around 4 BC. You'd be wanting to know, when did Matthew, Luke, whomever, sit down and write the story called the Gospel in our Bible according to Matthew or the Gospel according to Luke. The composition date, however, would scatter the books around way too much. I mean, it would just scatter them from here to kingdom come. It would be very confusing. Because as we saw last week, the English arrangement of the New Testament books has absolutely nothing to do with the date of composition. Absolutely nothing to do. with the date of composition. Let me just give you one of, well, you could take any book and you're going to have a problem, but here's the first problem, the biggest problem, if we want to study the New Testament from the composition date chronological approach. You would have to start with an epistle, the first book of the New Testament written, without knowing anything about Jesus Christ. I mean, that's why you've got the four Gospels at the beginning of the New Testament to start off telling you what it's all about. How would you like, your first book, your introduction to Christianity, is you pick up an epistle? You know nothing about Jesus Christ or the history, what he did, or his life, or birth, or death, or resurrection, or the founding of the church, or the prediction of the church's founding, or anything like that. And just pick up a book like James, the first epistle, and just simply start reading that. It would be confusing, to say the least. Now, what I want to do at this juncture of our study is give you the 27 books of the New Testament in their chronological order. But before I do that, I want to preface it with some other remarks. There are, I'll let you guess some of these tonight on our way to some final answers. Guess, we'll say test. That sounds better than the word guess. Guess implies you don't have any idea. You're just stabbing in the dark. Test means perhaps you know, you're being tested over it. There are some crucial dates in the New Testament that, if we can identify, well, obviously we can't from the New Testament, from extra-biblical sources, it goes a long way in the identification of the date of the composition of many of the New Testament books. Now, we don't have a lot of help with the four Gospels because, what do you have in Mark? What do you have in Luke? What do you have in Matthew that's going to tell us something about the composition date? There are some other things, especially when we get over to the epistles, where if we can date something reliably from extra-biblical sources, then I'm saying it'll go a long way, and I mean dating with preciseness, with precision, some anyway, of the New Testament books. From your knowledge of the New Testament, what are some of those events? They're events or things that take place that if we can date from extra-biblical sources, like let's say if you were to guess the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Well, we know that, AD 70. How does that help us date any New Testament book? Well, as you'll see, that's not one of the heavyweight times, but as you'll see, that could help with the Gospels. Because if the Gospels, in any of their passages, have any type of predictions that look forward to the Roman siege of the city, then we've got to deal with the issue whether or not that's just from Jesus' point of view as he spoke it, such as in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, or from the perspective of the one who's writing the gospel. You see, that becomes a rather difficult matter there to know now. Jesus predicts the future, the destruction of the temple and the city by the Romans, which we know from history took place in AD 70. Perhaps Matthew's writing in AD 80. He'll still use future tense in his gospel, predicting that because he's simply recording the words of Jesus, or will he? There's a lot of debate surrounding that. But that's not one of them. What are some things? Can you think of anything that would help us date New Testament books? You might not be able to think of these. They're rather, well, as you may think when you find out, they're rather small, but they are rather important. Any suggestions at all? Well, but there was a Passover every year. So we're wanting to know, when did Paul write 1 Corinthians? When did he write that? Was that AD 45, 55, 65, 50, 60, 47? When was that? How can we tell? You say, well, by internal evidence. Sometimes by internal evidence, but internal evidence and or often mixed with extra-biblical external evidence. How would we know that? She says, when the author died. How would we know that? For instance, well, just name anybody, Art. Let's just say John. I would assume a lot of you would be thinking of John. Well, that would give us the last date beyond which he couldn't write. You have your terminus a quo, terminus a quem. But what about the earliest date? If we know John happened to be one of the longest surviving of the apostles, and we know that we can move his material later in the first century than any other New Testament writer. But how early could we put it, though? You have a suggestion?
How about the ruling of King Agrippa, or when Herod had ruled? These other kings, they go by them. Because Paul was like talking to King Agrippa or Herod in the book of Acts.
Okay. All right, let's say we can date, which we can. Let's say we can date King Agrippa. All right, now tell me how that helps date a New Testament book.
We know that Paul had talked to him at that time, and he had written his book somewhere in the period of Acts.
Yeah, but when? Before or after he talked to Agrippa?
We have to study the book of Acts to find that out.
And some other material as well. See, what appears easy on the surface isn't necessarily easy. Even if you knew the date of Agrippa, and you knew that Paul talked to him, and all that's in Acts, what does that have to do with the writing of 2 Thessalonians? How would you know whether it was before or after? It's like that test we took when the church was meeting in our home all these years ago, and we were in the very beginning of biblical literature, and I was telling you that, in those days, biblical days, they had scrolls, and it wasn't divided up into chapters and verses and things. And what if you were just made to open up into what you found out later to be the middle of Isaiah and had to just read a verse? We practiced this with Jesus at the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke 4. How would you know if it wasn't, Isaiah 53, a passage that you knew very well, and you were looking for a certain text? How would you know whether to go forward or backward in that scroll? If you just opened it up and had no chapter, no verse divisions, and it just said, "Yea, doth the Lord say, my people are wicked." Well, where is that in Isaiah? I'm sure Isaiah says something essentially like that somewhere. Well, if I open up to that general of a phrase, and I'm looking for the passage that said, "Surely he hath borne my sicknesses and carried my pains," would I go forward or backwards? You wouldn't know unless you really know your manuscript of Isaiah. Well, the same is true with Agrippa here. Would you go forward or backwards in dating? If we could date, assuming we can date Agrippa, and we can, from extra biblical materials. Another suggestion.
How about the places in the epistle where Paul gives his travel plans?
Okay, now that's going to involve a lot of things. That's one way, an internal way, that you're going to be able to at least construct some type of chronology for a whole lot of the epistles. But I'm really talking about extra biblical things, though. That's internal evidence and witness there, and that's certainly very good.
You mentioned that sometimes talks about Aquila and Priscilla and having to flee from Rome because of persecution.
What specifically?
There was...
What type of edict was passed?
Well, they're expelling Jews from Rome.
Under whom?
Titus, maybe?
No. No. You're too late. Move back earlier. Where is it found? In the Bible or out of the Bible? Well, we have an extra biblical reference to that event in Suetonius' writings, the Roman writer, Suetonius. We have it also in the Bible. We just have a reference in the Bible, but Luke doesn't say, now this took place in the year 47 A.D. Now this is after the birth of Christ. Acts 18, the reign of Claudius. Turn over to Acts 18. That is one of three important things that if we can date, then we know when. See, all this will tell us is basically when Paul's in Corinth. That still doesn't, see, that just helps us with the narrative of Acts. Then we've got to go from that to what our brother back here said, internal evidence in the epistles to find out his relation from one city to another as he's writing these things. Verse 2 of Acts 18. They found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come. Now that means just recently this has happened. So if we can date this, then we know around what time we're talking about in Acts 18. Lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. And look at this parenthesis that Luke adds in. It's good that he does. He's got a few of these, not necessarily parentheses, but historical sidelights that will help us date matters. Because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, into parentheses. Well, we've got a historical writing. It's a very famous one that makes reference to some of the riots the Jews were causing over a man named Pestus. in the writings of Suetonius. And most people believe that's simply a Latinized form of the Greek Christ. That there were Jewish Christian problems in the city of Rome and the province of Italy. The Jews were stirring up riots. We've seen them do that throughout the book of Acts. Every time Christianity bursts into their midst, they stir up some type of riot, and they were expelled from Italy as a result of that. So we have writings in Suetonius concerning that. All right, there's one event. What's another one? One back in chapter 11 is pretty difficult to date. And it doesn't, well, it's not, well, let me go on and say what I was going to say as far as being difficult to date. It's during the reign of the same emperor, so we don't have a problem with that. We don't have an extra biblical reference to this, though. So we don't know if it's beginning, middle, or end of reign. And then secondly, and more importantly, it doesn't help us in dating any New Testament books. It just helps us date the events of Acts chapter 11. Now here's where you're going to be very careful to keep the distinction in your mind between an event date and a composition date. All this will help us do is date the events of Acts 11. Not the composition of Acts 11, its date of composition, or the book of Acts, or some other New Testament document. Acts 11:28. There stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit, he was a prophet, according to chapter 21, that there should be great dearth, that is a famine, through all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Now, it's a future prediction, so, even that doesn't really help you date even the events of Acts 11. Since it doesn't happen in Acts 11, it comes to pass later in the days of Claudius Caesar. The same Claudius as Luke makes reference to in Acts 18 and verse 2. But then the one really most important, and if you can get this date, then you can start working forward and backward from this date and put especially the Pauline corpus of literature together, is back in Acts chapter 18, and it concerns verse 12. If we can get this date, this is a major date we need in the New Testament for dating New Testament books, would be the date of the reign of the proconsul Gallio. Acts 18:12. We'll discuss this more when we discuss 1st and 2nd Corinthians. When Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. We see that Paul has made his way to Corinth at this time, Acts 18:1, and that he spends a year and a half, 18 months here. Look at verse 11. He continued there, that is in Corinth, 1 year and 6 months, 18 months, teaching the word of God among them. Well, he spent a year and a half. Well, was that in 45, 55, 65, 85? When was that? Well, it has to be whenever Gallio was proconsul. The two coincide. Here's an intersection of biblical history with extra-biblical history. An intersection between biblical history and extra-biblical history. Paul has to be there sometime when Gallio is there. We know that proconsuls are appointed for a period of 1 year. Well, that really helps it then. He wasn't like proconsul for 15 years and one 18-month period somewhere in that 15-year period Paul was there. We still would be left in the dark. We'd have a plus or minus 15-year margin of error here.
For the continuation of this method,
for a period of 1 year. Well, that really helps it then. He wasn't like proconsul for 15 years and one 18-month period somewhere in that 15-year period Paul was there. We still would be left in the dark. We'd have a plus or minus 15-year margin of error here. But if a proconsul is appointed for only 1 year, and he was, and Paul's there a year and 6 months, then the two overlap somewhere. Somehow they overlap. That's the most important date. You say, what is that date? Well, wait till later and we'll find out when that was. That helps us with Romans, it helps us with Corinthians, it helps us with dating several things. I can just say this in advance, that dating 1st and 2nd Corinthians is absolutely certain. I mean, we're not going to have that with most of the New Testament books. Probably more than half, there's a lack of certainty. Which brings me to a point I want to make about composition date, and it's just that. The dates that I'm going to give you here in a moment often involve some measure of speculation. If you want to choose to memorize them, that's fine. As we go, I'm not going to say it right now with each 20 of the 27 books, but as we go through our study in NT Intro, you'll see which ones are certain, which ones are more or less certain, at least we know we've got it within 2 or 3 years, and which ones we're just not for sure of. Whether it was AD 50, AD 60, AD 70, or AD 80, we just don't know. I'll let you know as we go along. If you don't choose to memorize them, and by the way, they're not that difficult to memorize. I used to have them memorized some years ago. I don't know that I could reel off every one of them in order, but I think I probably could. You can at least get them in some type of basic order, so you know kind of which were the first, 8, and which were the last 8, and which were the middle 8, as it were. It's really not that difficult. Now, another comment I want to make about the composition date. I'll have a lot of comments before I give you this. I'm wanting to safeguard myself from any future attacks. That is, I don't remember the precise source of my information here. I did this so many years ago that I don't remember exactly where I got all of this information from. I noticed that I have some various remarks written in by hand. My notes are always typed, but I have handwritten corrections and qualifications and things like that. So what I'm assuming, and this is, I checked it today just with the time I had. I mean, you've got to open up every scholarly book and check every book in the New Testament and see who says it was what date. I mean, that could take almost forever, checking every reference to what every person says and every reason why they say that Mark was AD 50 rather than AD 70 or vice versa would take just too long to do. But what I know that I have here is a consensus of conservative opinions. We're certainly not going to follow the liberals. God help us. No, God don't help us if we ever follow them. We deserve damnation if we follow the liberals. They throw everything into the 2nd century A.D. when all the apostles were dead and buried and returned to dust. We're going to keep everything back in the 1st century A.D. And the dates aren't just conservative, they are very conservative dates. I've noticed that the tendency, and this is just borne out time and time and time again, not only in our theological studies in this church, but our studies in Christian ethics, I guess especially, since we've been there and heavily there for so long, that the tendency of modern evangelicalism is to kind of buy into half of conservatism and half of liberalism, and as a result, shift the dates a lot later. That seems to be the tendency, a trend in modern evangelical circles. So these dates don't follow that trend. These dates follow the most conservative authors that you can find. Now, something else about the dates. We're still on composition before I give you those dates. Something else about the dates. As I just said a moment ago, some measure of speculation is involved. We may find ourselves sometime in the future, if and when the Lord tarries and leads us to perhaps study in detail one or more New Testament books, we may find ourselves in need of shifting the date I'm going to give you then from the date I'm giving you now. That will be because of the fact that the date I will give you then will be based on a lot more personal study of mine than these dates at this time. I find it safe now, rather than to spend a lot of time researching every one of these, to follow the most conservative trend I can find, which is to put the books at a rather early date. But there are all types of things that contribute to one's dating of a book. Internal evidence, external evidence, the nature of the author, the nature of the problem, to whom it was written, characteristics of the book, all types of things. It's much more complicated than just saying, well, why are you hedging about dates? Just tell us when each book was written. I wasn't there. I don't know when each book was written. Nobody else knows either. We've got to put a lot of information together and synthesize all of that to come up with sometimes an educated guess and hypothesis as to when a book was written. So, in other words, if you want it in plain language, here's what I'm saying. I may change these dates later on. I hope you won't find me at fault for doing that. It's for the reasons that I've just given you above. Something else I want to say about the dates. And it concerns, every point I'm making will tie into the point I just made. It hangs onto the coattails of the one that went before. I have found it in my years of shepherding this church and being responsible for the teachings in this church, as you well know, I found it increasingly difficult to keep the classes and studies that I deliver here within any reasonable bounds. And that's just because I'm reading so much and thinking so much, I always have something else to say. And it just goes on and on and on. I mean, we are getting up close to 300 messages in ethics, and we're just still at the beginning of the class. We're getting up to 300. 300 studies. 300, that's a lot of hours, a lot of study. There must be several million statistics or facts or statements made in 300 plus hours. Some of them are hour-and-a-half studies in Christian ethics. I don't want to get bogged down. I've got some reasons why. I don't want to get bogged down in New Testament. I could easily just keep on going and just go and go and go and do, detailed studies of, this book and that book. I decided not to do that in this class. I want to keep this within the bounds of sanity so that we'll get through before you have gray hair and you remember what I said at the very first teaching rather than barely remembering the 900th teaching. I want to get through with this, by next year sometime, by the first of next year, not next year sometime. I got to watch out. I have to qualify myself, and I leave myself a 12-month loophole there. And I always take advantage of that. By the beginning, by January of next year, I want to be through with this. Teaching it one time a week, sometimes skipping some services. Well, I don't know if I'm going to skip them. I may not be through by January, but I peg about 40 studies. I think we ought to be through in about 40 studies. We could go a lot longer than that. The New Testament is shorter than the Old. We did, 65? Somebody who studies the tape list? 65 in the Old. The New is shorter, but there's a lot more information there that's really applicable to us. We could go a lot more than 65, but next year we're going to find some changes in the church in several regards, and I want to be through with New Testament by the time we get to that. So that's why I'm not going to give you all the arguments for and against this date and that date and the other date. I'm just going to give you what is a consensus among the most conservative scholarship as to the date of the composition of these books. And if we find out it's different in heaven, then more power to us and to heaven. Okay, let's give ourselves the order with all of those introductory comments. Now, you remember what I just said, that we're not going to go in detail in New Testament intro, not in any section. Not in looking at the Gospels or Acts or the Epistles. We're going to be rather brief, because I want this to be introductory enough, survey-ish enough, that everyone can benefit from it. We don't just get totally over our heads in New Testament study. You'd want a number from 1 to 27 and start filling them in. What's the first book? What's the date? 45, we'll say. He can put 44, that's okay. The rest of us will put 45. Or you can put 46 if you want to, just for variety's sake. James, 45. Now, you see, there's no agreement on the date of James. You'll find James put 20 or 30 years later. So what makes us think that James, that's early? 45, the church is barely founded. 15 years after Pentecost. Well, barely, that's a decade and a half, but early compared to the later books, let's say. What makes us think James was written in AD 45? Well, there are certain reasons. We're not just picking these numbers out of a hat. There are certain reasons that would tend to make us think that James was written early. In a date of 45, you could put 44. No one knows 45. We just have to have kind of an early date, but it can't be too early. James isn't writing in Acts 3 right after the day of Pentecost, an epistle, when the church hasn't even been founded yet. He'd have to write to the people in Jerusalem, write to himself and fellow apostles. or the 3,000 saved on that day. He's writing to a different situation. That means we've got to move beyond, somewhat beyond, but we can't move too far, or we're too advanced in the organization of the church. One thing, as you'll see whenever we study the Epistle of James. So one thing concerns the organization of the church government and church polity. James is what we would call a primitive type epistle when it comes to church government and polity. And so that means the church has to be in a stage of infancy. Not the infancy of Acts 2 or Acts 5 or Acts 10, but still the state of infancy. What would be the second book? Galatians. Now that all depends on whether you follow the North Galatian theory of destination, which is the old view, the old typical view, or the modern recent view, which I hold to, the Southern Galatian destination theory. The old view, or the northern view, will give you a later date. It has to, as you'll see from the chronology of Acts. See, we're going to help you in this study tonight, get your footing and your grounding to put these things together and understand some things about what you're reading in the New Testament. The more modern or recent view, the Southern Galatian destination theory, would necessitate an earlier date. Okay? If you don't get all that about destination, the north and the south, we'll cover that when we cover Galatians. But if we follow, and I don't see any logical reason why we should not follow the more recent view of a South Galatia destination theory, then you're going to have to end up with an earlier date. That date, I would say, would be 48 A.D. Now, another big problem with Galatians is whether or not Galatians comes before or after that great Judaizing council, the Council of Jerusalem, around A.D. 49 to 50. If it comes afterward, which the older theory of the North Galatia destination hypothesis would hold, then you would expect that Paul, in writing to the Galatians, combating, the Judaizing tendency there, he would make mention of the fact that they had just held a council concerning Judaism and the church had made an official proclamation about it. I mean, why doesn't he? If the book of Galatians is written after that council in Acts 15, why doesn't he just fall back on that as precedent and say, now listen, I don't have to give you apostolic authority like he does in Galatians 1, saying I didn't receive this from man or through man, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ, from God the Father who raised him from the dead. When he could just say, we've already decided this. The church members, the apostles, the elders considered this question of Christ versus Christ and the law, which is Judaism, at the Council of Jerusalem last year or 3 years ago, and here is our pronouncement. He doesn't ever call back to that at all, which would tend to imply, although that's not a foolproof theory either, it would tend to imply that perhaps Galatians was written prior to the Jerusalem Council. Paul therefore has to use apostolic authority and not an ecumenical church council decision in Acts 15. Do you understand the argument that I just gave you there? You have to already know some things about the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 and what that was about and what the book of Galatians is all about. If I need to repeat something, just have me repeat it. Do I need to repeat something?
Yeah, what was the date of the council?
AD 49 to 50. It's just best to remember the year 50 since that's half-century mark. It's easier to remember. But you see it all the time both ways. Well, you can't see it all the time both ways. Half of the time you see it 49 and half of the time 50. So I generally find myself saying 49 to 50. You don't have any questions on all of that logic and argument. And you see, you have to do this whole process with each one of these New Testament books. It takes a lot of time. And I just haven't had the time in the last 15 years of my salvation to do that. So I'm going to follow scholars that have been studying it for years and years, and we'll hope they're right. If they're not, then we won't ever buy their books again, shall we? What would be number 3? I think most of these are fairly reliable until we get to some things like the Gospels, and I don't know that we really know when the Gospels were written. What would be number 3? Have you noticed the order? That's interesting. James, It's not Matthew. It's James. It's not John or Mark or Luke. James, Galatians. What this tells you, I'll respond to those two educated guesses here in a moment. You'll want to remember the first book of the New Testament, James, and the second thing we have is the first Pauline epistle. You see, every book won't be a first something, but our first book is the first book, and our second book, Galatians, is the first epistle by Paul to be written. All right, Colossians and 1 Thessalonians were guesses on number 3. 1 Thessalonians would be number 3. 1 Thessalonians, number 3. Around AD 50. Around AD 50. Number 4. Second Thessalonians. Written the same year, just a couple of weeks or months apart from one another. Well, that helps. That will help, as you'll see in the interpretation of the epistles. Written just a couple of months apart from each other. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. AD 50. Number 5. Numbers 3 and 4 aren't first anythings, so they don't really stand out as that significant as first anythings. Those are more Pauline epistles. Number 5 will be another first, though. Number 5 would be first gospel, Mark, AD 50. Now that's a conservative estimate. I think I've alerted you to this subject in New Testament studies somewhere on one of these first few tapes that we've done. That all depends on the so-called question of Mark and priority. If Mark came first, and that can be proven by the fact that Matthew and Luke extensively borrow from him, then Mark has to be the earlier of the three. If Matthew and Luke didn't copy from Mark and or made use of some other common source, then perhaps Mark would come later than Matthew and Luke, as late as perhaps AD 70. You'll see when we discuss the Gospels there have been different theories, one that places Mark first and the other that places Matthew first. We have to go back to some of the earliest church fathers and their writings and what they have to say as to the priority of Mark over against Matthew, or Matthew over against Mark, and we'll see what type of conclusions we can reach. But let's stay with this date for right now. Number 5, first gospel. So we have first book, James, first Pauline epistle, Galatians, first gospel, number 5, Mark, AD 50. Number 6. No, someone has already said it. 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians. AD 55. You say, oh, now that's a giveaway for the date of Gallio. Well, no, Paul has to have been in Corinth and left before he can write back to Corinth. That means Gallio's proconsulship has to be prior to AD 55. Okay? Number 7, 2 Corinthians. You won't always have 1 and 2 together like we've had with Thessalonians and Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, either later the same year or the next year, so 55, 56. You could put just 55 to keep both of them easy to remember if you want to. Both Corinthians, 55. Number 8, Romans. See, big heavyweight epistle Romans is an early one, 56. That's a reliable date right there. Corinthians are reliable dates. Romans is a reliable date. Those first four, we know that they're early. James, Galatians, 1, 2 Thessalonians, but as far as an actual date, that would escape us. Number 9 is not a reliable one. Well, I say it's not reliable, I mean we just don't know. Matthew, which I'm going to put around AD 60, and number 10, Luke, AD 60. Then numbers 11, 12, 13, and 14. Not the same year, not all of them, but they are together. They're known as the captivity epistles. The captivity epistles. And they would go like this. Ephesians would be number 11, AD 60. No, I take that back. Let's swap this. That's what someone else has to say, but I'm going to swap that. I'm going to say Colossians is number 11. Here's one of my handwritten notes. I'm trying to read it. Colossians, number 11. Number 12, Philemon, AD 60. Number 13, Ephesians. All right, so I gave you the wrong thing. Ephesians down for number 13. AD 60. You say, well, they're all the same year. Well, I think that we probably have them in this order, though. Colossians, in the order in which they were written. I think I can demonstrate that later. Colossians, then Philemon, then Ephesians, and then number 14, Philippians, AD 61. So to give that to you again, since I confused you a little, 11, 12, 13, and 14 would be Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, all in AD 60, and then Philippians, AD 61. Number 15, Acts, 61. Whole lot of guesses on when Acts was written. That all depends on what you make of Luke's conclusion. Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house, and received all that came in unto him, preaching the kingdom of God, and teaching those things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ, with all confidence, no man forbidding him. Why didn't Luke tell us the end of Paul's trial? He's there 2 years. We just were told in verse 30, 2 years. Was he acquitted, condemned? What happened? Did Luke intend to write a third work? His gospel was one. To Theophilus, his book of Acts, history of the church, was another, a third part. It all depends on, and it's going to involve speculation, your understanding of why Luke concludes Acts 28 with verse 31 and nothing else. Number 16, 1 Timothy, 62. Titus, 62. 1 Peter, 64. Now notice how late Peter's writings are compared to Paul's early writings. Book of Hebrews, 65. 2 Peter, we're on number 20, 67. Jude, 67. 2 Timothy, 67. We conclude with 5 final books, and they're all by John. And we don't really know the order of them, so let's just give ourselves the New Testament order. John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the book of Revelation. John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the book of Revelation. And these are dates that are often found. For John, AD 90. The 3 epistles, 90 to 95. The book of Revelation, perhaps the last New Testament book, 95. Now, let me say something on what you occasionally, not that often, but I guess it was more true in the past than it is in present church circles or biblical circles, what people call some of these books. I'm thinking of the 1st and 2nd type books, Thessalonians and Corinthians and Timothy and Peter, and then you've got 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It is simply improper, you hear some people say this on occasion, to refer to them by such names as 2 Corinthians. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8, 2 Corinthians, or turn to 3 John. You often hear that. 2 Peter or 1 Corinthians, but there's a basic English grammar fallacy there. Cardinal numbers tell us amount. 1, 2, 3, 4 are called cardinal numbers in English. They tell us amounts. 1 thing, there are 2 things, there are 3 things. You can say there are 3 epistles of John. Ordinal numerals, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, tell us rank. Rank, for instance, in order. Now that may not be a big deal to you, but I hear people say that, and then I just go, whew, praise God. You don't even think about it, but it bothers me that 2 Corinthians, 2 means that there are 2 of them. If you mean the 2nd book, then you have to say 2nd. You have to use an ordinal numeral and not a cardinal one. I mean, there's all the difference in the world. If your wife is cooking hamburgers and telling her, I want 2 burgers in that, and I want the 2nd one. That means all the difference in the world. The 2nd means you can give the 1st to somebody else. 2 means I want both of them together. So when you say 3 John, we're going to turn to all 3 of them, because you said all 3 of them, 3 John. That's a cardinal numeral. An ordinal one tells us rank. Which one? The 1st one, the 2nd one, or the 3rd one? Didn't you really like to hear that tonight? I bet you didn't even know that before. Okay, some important things about this chronological order. If you don't memorize all the dates, at least remember this. 1st book, 1st epistle of Paul, 1st gospel, last epistle of Paul, last New Testament book.